pain and fatigue, two of the most common complaints that leads one to seek out the expertise of a healthcare provider. In fact, this article, entitled Top 10 Reasons People Visit Their Primary Care Physician, has pain and fatigue as at least three of the top 10, possibly even five, depending on what they actually meant by abdominal symptoms and leg symptoms. Now, to fully understand pain syndromes, we have to first talk about how a neuron actually works. A resting neuron is more negatively charged on the inside relative to the outside and is typically resting at negative 70 millivolts. What leads to this discrepancy is the higher concentration of sodium on the outside and higher concentration of potassium on the inside of the neuron. Now, neurons obviously don't just stay in this resting state the entire time. So, when a neuron fires, what happens is these ions actually switch places. Sodium rushes into the cell and potassium rushes out of the cell. And what this leads to is a change in the polarity of the neuron, making it more positively charged on the inside relative to the outside, and that leads to the neuron firing, or what they call an action potential. Remember, that neuron was resting at negative 70 millivolts. It now moves a little bit more positive to negative 55 millivolts, and because of the ion switching, and once that takes place, it reaches negative 55 millivolts and an action potential forms. It's got to reach negative 55 millivolts. Anything less than that, and it won't fire. And if this is a pain fiber, when it goes off and fires, you will experience pain. But once this occurs, the neuron has to go back to its resting state. These ions, so sodium and potassium, they went on a little vacation, but now it's time for them to head back home. And what keeps this whole symphony running is what we call the sodium potassium pump. For every two potassium ions that it pumps into the cell, it has to pump three sodium ions out of the cell, pumping them back to where they started. But just like how your vehicle has to have fuel in order to run, this pump also needs fuel, and its fuel comes in the form of ATP. Now, this is an important part because ATP, our body's energy source, is produced by a cell called the mitochondria. And if mitochondria are impaired, which is often the case when it comes to fatigue syndromes due to an anemia, blood sugar issues, inflammation, a sedentary lifestyle, chemical exposure, a thyroid issue, and on it goes, what happens is when this pain fiber fires and there's this influx of sodium into the neuron and there's not enough energy or ATP to power that sodium potassium pump, that neuron now gets stuck in a state where the inside of the neuron is more positively charged when it should be negatively charged. And in fact, in this article, they actually surveyed individuals who were diagnosed with a genetic mitochondrial disease. And what they found was that almost 67% of that group had chronic pain. If you're interested in learning more about chronic fatigue syndrome in relation to mitochondrial disease, I want you to click up here. What this ends up leading to is the resting membrane potential of that neuron is now a little bit closer to threshold or closer to that negative 55 millivolts, meaning that that neuron now doesn't require as much stimulus in order for it to fire. Remember, this neuron should be resting at negative 70 millivolts. Then, once enough sodium ions come in or potassium ions go out, that neuron gets a little bit more positive, and once that happens, it hits negative 55, and then when it hits negative 55, it fires. But now imagine that you cannot power the sodium potassium pump in order to get those ions back to where they belong. That neuron's resting membrane potential is now a little bit more positive. It could be negative 60 or negative 65. It's become a little bit closer to the negative 55, meaning now it requires less sodium coming in or less potassium going out to actually move that needle. And how this relates to pain syndrome is because now less of a stimulus is required to facilitate that neuron firing. So going back, if this is a pain fiber that we're talking about, now a rather trivial stimulus that really shouldn't be painful can come in and activate those pain pathways, leading to the perception of pain. The most extreme case I personally ever seen of this was a woman who she was sitting in a wheelchair in a medical transport vehicle and they were hit from behind. She then goes flying all around within the vehicle, hitting all over the place. And fast forward, she's sitting in my office and she's in her wheelchair. The air condition turns on and she mentions how just the breeze from the vent on her legs was very painful. And she was wearing pants. So what can we do about it? Well, in this article, it says that protecting the mitochondrial function would be a promising strategy to alleviate or prevent chronic pain states. And as you can imagine, that's a lot easier said than done. And so, when it actually comes to managing chronic pain syndromes, there are a myriad of factors at play, and there are no two cases that are the exact same. So, if you're struggling with a pain syndrome, I'm going to put a link in the description of this video where you can go and download a free PDF guide that I created discussing pain syndromes, the mechanism behind them, and all the factors involved, and how, more importantly, how I personally think through managing someone with a pain syndrome.